مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. ضيفي اليوم هو بروس هوفمان، المختص بدراسة الإرهاب والتطرف لأكثر من 4 عقود، وهو أستاذ في جامعة جورج تاون. شغل سابقا منصب رئيس مؤسسة الأبحاث والتطوير في مكافحة الإرهاب، وكان أول مدير لمركز جامعة سانت أندروز لدراسة الإرهاب والعنف السياسي، كما شغل عددا من المناصب المهنية الهامة الأخرى، وذلك لمناقشة تصنيف العنف كإرهاب، وكيف نعرف حوادث العنف ومرتكبيها كإرهابيين أم لا. مرحبا بروس.
Thank you very much for having me.
دعنا نبدأ بتعريف الإرهاب.
How terrorism should be defined, of course, is a very difficult question that has been debated and struggled over for decades now. Um, Many years ago, there was a survey of 100 academics on how they define terrorism, and they gave 104 answers. So that underscores how difficult it is. But I would say terrorism is violence or the threat of violence designed to achieve fundamental political change.
لماذا تصنف بعض الجماعات والميليشيات على أنها منظمة إرهابية من قبل دول ما دون غيرها من الدول؟ هل للسياسة دخل هنا؟
I think a very reductionist answer would be, it depends if you identify with the victim or the perpetrator. If you identify with the victim who has suffered at the hands of this violence, you call it terrorism. If you identify with the perpetrator, if you understand the perpetrator's cause, perhaps even sympathize or understand the perpetrator's cause, then you often prefer to call it something else. And this is because terrorism has become one of the most pejorative or negative words of our time. No one wants to be called a terrorist. Think about it. There's almost no terrorist group ever in history that has ever used that word in their title. They're the Red Army faction. They're the base. They're the Popular Front. It's all different terminology used because the terrorists themselves know that this is a very negative label that, if applied against them, has a number of disadvantageous consequences.
حتى أكون أكثر تحديدا ربما، ماذا عن حزب الله في لبنان؟
Well, this is part of the problem in defining terrorism, is that often it doesn't fall into neat categories. I think it would be a mistake to exclusively describe Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, although it certainly has been classified as such, for instance, by the United States. And Hezbollah has schools, it has clinics, it engages in social welfare activity. Let's face it, it controls the Lebanese government. It has many political allies that are represented in the cabinet. But that's why I prefer not to use the label terrorist for entities or even for people, but to use it to describe the types of actions or the types of violence that these groups engage in. And when civilians are targeted, it often, very often, is terrorism.
طيب، لماذا تم تصنيف حزب الله إرهابيا من قبل الولايات المتحدة، لكن الأمر ليس كذلك في أوروبا مثلا؟
Well, again, I think this is because of the complexity of defining terrorism. The definition I offered a moment ago is really a sentence-long definition, where almost any definitions then have any number of caveats and qualifications. At the end of the day, it's a political choice or even an ideological choice. It is a way to condemn or to express your opprobrium for an entity or a movement that you might not agree with. You might, in fact, disagree with profoundly. So the problem with terrorism, I mean, the United Nations has struggled for over 6 decades to come up with an acceptable definition. The trouble with it is that it's something that is so complex and is often evolving, where you don't have pure terrorist entities, that you have terrorist entities that do many other things that have nothing to do with terrorism. That makes the definition very difficult to arrive at, because some people prefer to, let's say, emphasize the nonviolent dimension. Others prefer to focus on the violent dimension.
لاحظ كذلك أن إدارة بايدن رفعت تصنيف الحوثيين في اليمن من قائمة الإرهاب، كيف تفسر ذلك؟
Well, all sorts of designations, especially the U.S. State Department designation. I mean, we're talking about designations that often have a political motive, that are attempting to influence the combatants in a particular struggle. And if it's seen that you can influence them by demonizing them, by labeling them terrorists, that often results in the case. If, however, it appears that perhaps there's possibilities of some sort of negotiated settlement and lifting the terrorism designation is beneficial, such as recently occurred with the Sudan, for example, then it's seen that this is no longer a very useful label.
هل هناك فرق بين الإرهاب السني والإرهاب الشيعي؟ لأنه يبدو أن هناك نوعا من التفهم من قبل الغرب للإرهاب الشيعي.
No, I think that's because many of the Sunni groups or many of the Salafi jihadi groups, as I think is more specific, have nothing to do with any state patrons. They exist entirely on their own. They are true irregular forces. Whereas, as you've just described, many of the Shia militias, which is a much more anodyne, a much more neutral term, are either tied to states or less irregular, seem to be extensions of a foreign nation's military force. And therefore, we use all sorts of other terms for them, not necessarily terrorism or terrorists.
حديثك يأخذنا إلى مثال الحشد الشعبي في العراق. كيف يمكن تصنيفه؟
Well, this I think leads to these immense complications. Stepping back for a minute, let's say amongst the few things that people agree on in a definition of terrorism is that it's violence perpetrated by non-state actors, not acting on behalf of governments. That's not to say that governments don't agree or don't wage wars of terror, that they don't terrorize civilians, let's say by indiscriminate bombing campaigns or other measures. But what we accept as terrorism is that it's non-governmental, at least historically. And that's led, I mean, just as you're suggesting, to lots of gray areas and lots of contentiousness where entities have elements of what we might otherwise classify or categorize of terrorism, but because of one specific dimension, let's say a government connection, we don't call it terrorism.
اعذرني على المقاطعة هنا. في الحالة الإيرانية تم تصنيف الحرس الثوري إرهابياً وهو يتبع للدولة. كيف تفسر ذلك؟
It's exactly the inconsistency. And this goes back to your original question, why it's so difficult to define terrorism. Firstly, it's subjective, as I described. As we've just discussed, it becomes very political. And as your question just suggests, it's not consistent. So that's why there is no universal accepted definition of terrorism. Terrorism is something the other person does, not what you do or not what your allies do. That, I think, is probably the clearest definition. And that, I think, refers to the fact that no one wants to be called a terrorist. It has an undeniably, the one thing people agree on, it has an undeniably negative connotation.
في العراق كان هناك تجربة ناجحة، لا أدري إذا كنت تتذكرها، عن الصحوات في محاربة القاعدة. فُكِكت الصحوات لاحقاً. لماذا لم يواجه الحشد الشعبي نفس المصير؟
Oh, it's just, I think, I mean, it's almost an apples and oranges. The events of a decade and a half ago were just very different. United States influence in the region was very different. Iraq was in a problematical condition in 2006, but it is not nearly, I would argue, as fractured as it is today. I mean, Iraq, of course, has suffered terribly under the reign, at least in the western part of the country, from the Islamic State, for instance. Iranian influence in Iraq rather, has also increased to an extent that didn't exist a decade and a half ago. So we're really talking about an entirely different situation now.
بما أنك تحدثت عن داعش آخر وجه معروف للإرهاب في المنطقة، أين ذهب عناصر تنظيم الدولة؟ هل تبخروا؟
They haven't disappeared, unfortunately. I would say there's still 8 to 10,000 or so, perhaps, still fighting in eastern Syria, still deeply underground in Iraq, but still carrying out attacks. Last summer, there was a 25% increase in Islamic State attacks in Iraq alone. Many of them have fled to North Africa, in particular, other parts of the Middle East. And this, I think, is one of the challenges, is that the Islamic State may have ceased to exist, and the caliphate that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared in 2014 may no longer be a reality. But as we see recently in Mozambique, we may see the Islamic State as a falling star, but very clearly there are radical groups in Africa, the Middle East, Caucasus, South Asia, even Southeast Asia, that still see an advantage in hitching to their fortunes to what they see is a continuingly, at least visible star in the sky of the Islamic State. And this is why a group, a local group in Mozambique, for example, hitches its fortunes to the Islamic State because they see benefit in it. And as long as that's the case, it means that the center of the Islamic State may have contracted, but the periphery is expanding.
كيف تفسر أن يتنقلوا بهذه السهولة بين الدول والقارات؟
Well, there's one simple answer is that ISIS or the Islamic State in a very short span of time amassed a lot of money. Just a few months ago, the United States Treasury estimated that at $300 million in cash reserves. The United Nations said that the Islamic State has perhaps a third of that, 100 million. Nonetheless, that's a lot of cash that can be used to bribe, to suborn, to facilitate rat lines that enabled foreign fighters and ISIS commanders to escape from Syria and to reappear elsewhere, North Africa, Central Africa.
طيب هؤلاء هل يمثلون تهديداً حقيقياً للمنطقة الآن؟
50 people have been beheaded in Mozambique recently. Over 2,000 people have been killed there. Mozambique is not a country that in the past had to deal with the threat of the Islamist, the Salafi jihadi type of brand of terrorism that the Islamic State exports. To me, that's extremely worrisome. ISIS had gotten a toehold in Nigeria with Boko Haram, and then, of course, in North Africa. And then it expanded to Central Africa, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to Chad, to Cameroon, and now to South Africa and Mozambique. I would be concerned. I mean, it shows, this is the problem, it shows that the idea of the Islamic State still has resonance. Their narrative still attracts interest and support.
ماذا عن الانخراط في عملية تفاوض مع منظمات إرهابية؟ هل يمثل ذلك حلاً لبعض الأزمات؟
If they are willing to stop using violence and if they are willing to participate in democratic processes. The problem with most terrorist organizations is they seek to impose their own, often very idiosyncratic totalitarian view on the societies they're involved in. And even though ISIS, for instance, or the Islamic State, for instance, may have spread to other countries, it's not that they're welcomed by the civilians there. The ordinary citizens are their victims. And this, I think, becomes one of the challenges of our times, is how can we resist the spread of these ideologies that are unwanted by the people in these places and that are imposed upon them.
وكأن الدول العربية والغربية ليست على نفس التردد فيما يتعلق بمسألة التصنيف على لوائح الإرهاب. هل من طريق مختصر للتوافق بينهما حول هذه النقطة؟
Well, this, I think, becomes the key issue, is what are their activities like? Are they targeting civilians? Are they advocating and actually using violence in the pursuit of their aims? So that, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Also, in many instances, we're not talking about monolithic organizations or movements even. They're not like states in the sense that there's a head that controls every aspect of their operations. And often their operations manifest themselves, or their activities manifest themselves in different ways in different countries. And I think we have to take account of those unique manifestations and resist the temptation to apply blanket solutions. We always have to look at the local problems and the grievances within a specific country or within a specific community that is giving rise to unrest and political violence, and seek to understand and address the grievances that have led to the violence, which may be completely separate from the organizations themselves that may be intent on using violence no matter what. They see violence as an end in itself. But the point I want to make is that this is the problem with defining terrorism and understanding terrorism, is that it doesn't move in a linear fashion, and there's not a coherency to it. It's very idiosyncratic. It emerges and flourishes in some countries and not in others, and often based on a very unique and, in many cases, idiosyncratic combination of factors.
لماذا الجيل الجديد من الجهاديين أكثر عنفاً من الجيل الذي سبقه؟
Yes, and you're absolutely right. I think the Islamic State really changed the nature of terrorism in a very short span of time. It showed itself to be immensely dexterous in its use of social media to attract, or not even to attract, to radicalize and recruit supporters. I mean, it was unprecedented that we know for a fact that the Islamic State attracted over 40,000 persons from at least 120 and perhaps as many as 140 different countries. And this is exactly at a time when the Obama administration was touting countering violent extremism, when we were trying to embrace the fact, more so than we had done in the past, that this was not a war of kinetics, but a war of ideas. And yet at the same time, the Islamic State was able to capitalize on social media in a way that no one really understood and summon this global, in essence, I mean, you have 120 to 140 citizens from 120 to 140 countries, and there are approximately 190 countries in the United Nations. Most of the countries in the world saw their citizens volunteer to fight with the Islamic State. Part of the problem, too, is that the attraction was what one might call ultra-violence. It was the worst excesses of terrorism: beheadings, burning captured military personnel alive, enslavement of people. I mean, it was absolutely tragic and on a horrific scale. And that's why I think even today, at a time when many want to declare, as we approach the third decade of the so-called war on terror, everybody wants to declare victory, focus our attention away from countering terrorism to other allegedly more important issues. I would say they're all important, but the rise of ISIS, or the Islamic State, and the fact that the Islamic State became so excessive is part of a trajectory that we have to guard against in the future.
طيب، بما أنك جئت على ذكر المقاتلين الأجانب، ما أفضل طريقة للتعامل معهم؟ بعض الدول تفكر في سحب جنسياتهم، ما رأيك؟
Well, it's an enormous problem, because denying them this citizenship then means that they're stateless and that they're going to drift around the world and recreate the same problem we had at the end of the 20th century of the wandering mujahideen, which in fact was a very prescient intelligence analysis that was written in August 1993 by someone in the State Department's intelligence and research arm that no one ever paid attention to. And of course, resulted in the problems we had with the 9/11 attacks and the rise of Al-Qaeda and emergence of Osama bin Laden. But I think that's the fundamental problem with terrorism and counterterrorism. This is not unique to the United States, but it's been a problem with the United States. Many countries share this problem. They do not have consistent policies. When terrorism slaps them in the face, when there's some terrible terrorist incident, or when a heinous group like the Islamic State arises with its acts of savagery, we pay attention. But then as the threat recedes, as the terrorist groups are pushed on the back heel, we forget about them and we move on. It would be far better to have a more sustained and consistent counterterrorism policy rather than the one we've seen of the past 20 years that seems to swing from one extreme to the other, from invading and occupying countries with hundreds of thousands of troops, which obviously did not work in Iraq and Afghanistan, to now where even small numbers of US or European or other countries' military personnel serving as advisors and trainers as seen as too much, is seen as an extravagance. So it would be far better. And I think also the United States, for instance, from this consistency might have greater influence and leverage if it had a more consistent policy. But again, other countries have the same inconsistency. They pay attention to terrorism in the immediate aftermath of an attack and then forget about it. And forgetting about it doesn't mean just ignoring the threat, but forgetting about the causes, the grievances that have given rise to terrorism in the first place. And that would be far simpler to address when they're embryonic than when they've already fully blossomed into terrorism violence.
لو تحدثنا عن بعض الأمثلة الناجحة في المنطقة وبرامجها لاحتواء العناصر الضالة، تحضرني هنا التجربة الجزائرية والتجربة السعودية في هذا الخصوص. ما رأيك بهذه البرامج؟
Well, I think you have to offer persons a way out of terrorism, but there have to be guardrails in place. And those persons who seek to enter reformation or rehabilitation programs, those programs have to be very closely monitored and overseen and have to be serious. These people have to make a very serious commitment that is monitored to enter into peaceful processes for achieving their political aims or political change, that there has to be a quid pro quo. It can't, I don't think it works in a blanket sense. And this requires tremendous resources. And also we have to have realistic expectations. Not everyone who lays down their arms and agrees not to be a terrorist won't at some point in the future perhaps take up arms and become a terrorist again. But if you can raise the threshold high enough that it is tolerable for those societies, much like with criminals, we don't expect every criminal that we put in prison is going to be rehabilitated and reformed and never return to criminality. But if we achieve a high enough percentage, that is deemed as something that's acceptable. So I think there does have to be a way out of terrorism, just like there's a way for terrorists to state sponsors of terrorism, for instance, to be removed from the United States State Department list of terrorism sponsors. If there was no way to be removed and no process, why would a country ever turn its back on sponsoring terrorism? So there have to be those incentives, but they have to be very clear and they have to be, as I said, overseen and monitored and be seriously applied. And then they can have many benefits. I mean, not least that it also gives a window not just to the intelligence communities of these countries and law enforcement, but also to academics and experts and scholars to better understand why persons become terrorists, how they are recruited, how terrorist group cohesion is maintained, how terrorist decision-making is undertaken. So there can be benefits. But again, I go back to my original point, there have to be very clear guardrails in place. Otherwise, you lose the confidence of the population.
ماذا عن الدول التي مولت الإرهاب في المنطقة؟ كيف استطاعت أن تتوارى عن العقوبات، عن المحاسبة؟
Well, this reminds me of how today Al-Qaeda portrays itself, and this is their words, as quote unquote moderate extremists, as more palatable or acceptable in contrast to the depredations and excesses of the Islamic State. It's like being a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you're not. And I would say that the same thing, you can't be moderate extremists. You're extremists if you're using violence in pursuit of your aims and if you're killing elected officials, or certainly if you're targeting civilians. And the same has to apply to state sponsors of terrorism. We've always known that there are two types of state sponsors, active and tacit. Active state sponsors are those who provide weapons, training, communications, intelligence to terrorist groups and often give them orders. And passive or tacit, where groups allow them to use their territory, to transit through their territory without being arrested, even if there's an Interpol red notice, for example, that allow them, most importantly, to transfer funds across their borders. And this is why we find that unanimity against countering terrorism is so difficult. There was a very brief period in the year or two aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, when there was this international cooperation in preventing terrorists from traveling to one place to another freely, in staunching their flows of finances, and it reduced terrorism. But of course, this goes back to an earlier point I made, is the more successful we were, the less vigilant countries became, and the more their attention shifted elsewhere. And then we see the terrorism problem once again rising and becoming a challenge.
شكرا جزيلا لك بروس على هذه المناقشة الكاشفة حول تجربتك وخبراتك. شكرا جزيلا لك. مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. السلام عليكم.